Commander Vextall made a decision that would haunt his dreams for years to come. He walked over to the main control panel and activated the auditorium's emergency security protocols. The massive doors sealed shut with a deep mechanical hum and privacy. Screens engaged automatically, ensuring that whatever happened next would remain completely contained within these walls. The soft humming of the security system sent a clear message to every cadet present. This conversation had just become classified. At the highest possible levels, several alien students shifted nervously in their seats as they realized they were now part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple academic discussion. Cadet G1 Commander Vextall said carefully, his reptilian features showing unusual concern. "Perhaps you should return to your seat. We can discuss this matter privately in my office after class ends." His attempt to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation was obvious to everyone present. But G1 remained standing at the front of the room. "No, Commander," G1 replied, his voice now carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire auditorium. "These cadets deserve to understand what they are really studying when they analyze historical battles. They have been treating warfare like an academic exercise, like chess games with rules and honor codes. They need to know what real combat actually looks like when lives are on the line." Several alien students throughout the seating. Areas shifted uncomfortably as the comfortable distance they had always maintained from the violence in historical footage began to rapidly disappear. The battle clips were no longer just educational materials from distant conflicts, but personal. Testimonies from someone who was sitting right there among them. A Veldorian cadet named Kira spoke up again. Her crystalline voice trembling noticeably. The official reports said that the human pilot from Kepler Station suffered significant psychological damage from the engagement. They mentioned recurring nightmares and complete inability to integrate back into normal civilian society. Her empathic abilities were picking up waves of pain radiating from G1 even across the large auditorium. G1's carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely at her words. For a brief moment, the hardened warrior facade slipped away entirely, revealing the deeply damaged young man who had been hiding underneath the surface. "They do not tell you about the sounds," he said so quietly that the perfect acoustics were barely able to carry his voice to the back rows. "The enemy pilots when their ships were disabled, but not completely destroyed." He continued, his shoulders beginning to shake slightly. "When they knew that death was inevitable but could not escape from their damaged vessels, they made sounds that will stay with me until the day I die." The auditorium temperature seemed to drop to freezing as his words penetrated the minds of the alien cadets who had been taught that space battles were clean, clinical affairs. Ships simply exploded in brief flashes of light, and then everything was over. The reality of prolonged suffering and psychological warfare was something their instructors had very carefully omitted from the standard curriculum. They screamed in frequencies that human ears are specifically designed to detect. G1 said, his voice growing even softer and more distant. "Those sounds become part of your memory permanently. Every night when I try to sleep, I can still hear them begging for mercy in languages I had never learned. The worst part is knowing I could not show them any compassion, because innocent civilian lives depended on me completing my mission successfully." Several alien students began shifting nervously in their seats as they started to understand that their comfortable academic perspective on violence had been built on a foundation of carefully maintained ignorance. The historical battles they studied with such intellectual curiosity were not abstract tactical exercises, but real events that destroyed real people and left permanent psychological scars on the survivors. Minho finally managed to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Jiwan, why did you never tell us about any of this? We have been studying together and sharing meals for 3 years, and you never mentioned your military service." His question carried the heavy weight of personal betrayal, as if learning about his classmates' past had fundamentally changed their entire relationship. Because I wanted to forget everything that happened. Jiwan replied, his shoulders sagging visibly under the psychological burden he had been carrying alone. When I enrolled, here under my civilian identity, I genuinely believed I could learn to become the kind of human that other species expected us to be. He looked around the room, taking in the hundreds of alien faces staring down at him. Peaceful, diplomatic, focused. On building rather than destroying, I thought maybe if I studied warfare from a safe academic perspective, I could finally make sense of what I had done and find some way to live with the memories Yuna reached out tentatively, as if to offer some kind of comfort. But she stopped abruptly when she saw the look in his dark eyes. There was something there that warned against casual physical contact, a wariness that suggested his combat instincts were still those of a battle-hardened veteran. Rather than a fellow student, Commander Vextall found himself in the unprecedented situation of watching his classroom transform into an impromptu therapy session with 500 alien witnesses to a complete human psychological breakdown. The implications for interspecies relations throughout the Alliance could be absolutely catastrophic if this information ever spread beyond these sealed walls. Yet despite his professional concerns, he found himself genuinely worried about Jiwan's mental welfare. The signs of severe combat trauma were unmistakable and transcended all species boundaries. This young human was clearly suffering from wounds that went far deeper than anything that could be treated with conventional medicine. The battle footage we just watched shows incredible tactical brilliance. The commander said very carefully, choosing each word, but it also demonstrates something else entirely. The flight patterns are not merely strategic, they are deeply emotional. There is fury driving those maneuvers and desperation in something that looks almost like madness. Jiwan completed the sentence for him with a bitter laugh. No, Commander. Not madness. Pure, concentrated rage at anything and everything that dared to threaten innocent lives. That is what humans truly become when everything we care about is placed in mortal danger. He turned to face the assembled alien cadets directly. We do not fight for abstract concepts like glory or honor or tactical superiority. Fight because something fundamental inside our psychology breaks completely when we witness suffering that we have the power to prevent. The revelation sent shockwaves through the auditorium as hundreds of alien minds struggled to process this information. Their entire understanding of human nature was being systematically dismantled by someone they had dismissed as just another quiet student. And the most terrifying part, Jiwan added with a cold smile, is that every single human carries this same potential for violence. We simply choose not to use it unless the situation becomes absolutely desperate. But when that moment comes, when innocent lives hang in the balance, we will become whatever we need to become to protect them. Weight of his words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket as the alien cadets began to realize that their assumptions about humanity might have been not just wrong, but dangerously naive. The peaceful diplomatic species, they thought, they knew was apparently just the surface layer of something much more complex and potentially threatening. Time seemed to stop completely in the massive auditorium as Jiwan's words echoed off the curved walls. The silence that followed was so complete that many cadets could hear their own hearts beating in their chests. 500 alien faces turned toward the quiet human student who had just claimed to be the legendary pilot from the battle footage. Their expressions ranged from complete shock to total disbelief. Commander Vextall stood frozen at the front of the room, his scaled hand hovering over the control panel where the battle footage remained, paused mid-explosion. His yellow eyes narrowed as he stared at Jiwan, trying to determine if this was some kind of joke or mental breakdown. The idea that this unremarkable human cadet could be the warrior they had just watched seemed impossible to believe. The other alien students began whispering among themselves in dozens of different languages. Their confusion was obvious as they tried to make sense of what they had just heard. Ji-won had been their classmate for 3 years. He was quiet and studious, always sitting in the back and never drawing attention to himself. He had never mentioned any military service, let alone participation in one of the most famous battles in recent history. Minho and Yuna turned to stare at their fellow human with wide eyes and open mouths. They had known Ji-won since their first day at the academy and had shared meals and study sessions with him for 3 years. He had never spoken about his past or mentioned any combat experience. Now he was claiming to be a legendary war hero, and neither of them knew what to think. Commander Vextall finally found his voice, though it carried a tremor of uncertainty that was unusual for the normally confident instructor Cadet Park Ji-won. "Please explain your statement," he said in his booming voice that carried clearly through the massive room. His reptilian features showed obvious skepticism, as did most of the faces staring down from the curved seating areas. Ji-won slowly rose from his seat, and for the first time in 3 years, his classmates saw him move with purpose and confidence. His posture straightened and his shoulders squared in a way that suggested military training. The nervous student they thought they knew seemed to transform before their eyes into someone completely different. The battle took place on stardate 2387.156. Ji-won began, his voice steady and clear. Despite the hundreds of eyes focused on him, I was piloting experimental fighter craft designation Talon 7. The enemy fleet consisted of 43 vessels, including 7 heavy cruisers and 2 Dreadnoughts-class warships. The specificity of his details sent murmurs rippling through the crowd like waves on a pond. These were not facts that could be easily found in standard textbooks or casual research. The technical designations and exact ship counts were the kind of information that would only be known by someone who had actually participated. In the battle, Commander Vextall quickly pulled up additional files on his personal data pad, his clawed fingers moving rapidly across the holographic interface. As he cross-referenced classified battle reports that were not part of the standard curriculum, his expression grew more serious. The details Ji-won had provided matched perfectly with military records that were sealed at the highest security levels. The engagement began when Kepler Station sent out an emergency distress signal on all frequencies. Ji-won continued, his eyes becoming distant, as if he was reliving the memories instead of just recounting them. By the time I arrived at the coordinates, the civilian station was already under heavy bombardment from the enemy fleet. Their defensive shields were failing rapidly. Several alien cadets exchanged nervous glances as they realized that the tactical details being provided matched exactly with classified reports they had never seen. The battle had been studied by military historians for years, but most of the specific information remained locked away in government archives. There were 3 evacuation ships filled with civilian refugees trapped in the crossfire. Ji-won said, his voice growing harder. I had approximately 17 minutes before the station's shields would collapse completely and those innocent people would die. The enemy commander was using them as bait, trying to draw out Alliance reinforcements into a trap. The alien students found themselves leaning forward, in their seats, despite their confusion and growing fear. The clinical way Ji-won described the tactical situation was completely different from his usual quiet manner of speaking. It was the voice of someone who had made life and death decisions. Under impossible pressure, Commander Vextall looked up from his data pad, his expression now showing genuine concern rather than skepticism. The classified files he was accessing revealed disturbing details about human military capabilities that were kept secret to prevent panic among other Alliance species. The footage they had been watching represented just a small fraction of what humans were actually capable of in combat situations. Cadet Ji-won, the commander said carefully, choosing his words. The military medical records indicate that the pilot from Kepler Station survived the engagement but suffered severe psychological trauma. The files show he was medically discharged and relocated to a peaceful civilian assignment for recovery. The unspoken question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Jiwon nodded slowly, and for the first time since standing up, his confident facade began to crack slightly. The doctors said I was suffering from something they called combat stress syndrome. He explained, his voice becoming quieter. They recommended that I pursue a quiet career in education or civilian administration. They thought removing me from military environments would help me learn to live with what I had done. The weight of his words settled over the auditorium like a heavy blanket. These alien cadets had been studying warfare as an academic exercise, analyzing historical battles like chess games played by distant strangers. They had never considered that the people in those combat recordings were real individuals with real trauma who might be sitting among them in their very classrooms, so I decided to enroll in the academy under my civilian identity. Jiwon continued, his shoulders sagging slightly under the psychological burden he had been carrying. I wanted to see if I could learn to be normal again. Maybe if I studied military tactics from an academic perspective, I could make sense of what happened and find a way to heal. A Veldorian cadet named Kira raised one crystalline hand hesitantly. Her species was known for their empathic abilities, and she could sense the pain radiating from Jiwon even across the large auditorium. But the reports mentioned that the pilot suffered recurring nightmares and difficulty integrating back into peaceful society, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jiwon's composure finally cracked completely at her words. The hardened warrior mask slipped away, revealing the damaged young man underneath. They don't tell you about the screaming, he said quietly, his voice barely audible in the massive room. The enemy pilots. I mean, when their ships were disabled, but not completely destroyed when they knew death was coming but could not escape. The temperature in the auditorium seemed to drop several degrees as his words sank in. The alien cadets had been taught that space battles were clean clinical affairs where ships simply exploded in brief flashes of light. The reality of prolonged suffering and psychological warfare was something their instructors had carefully omitted from the standard curriculum. They screamed in frequencies that human ears can detect. Jiwon continued, his voice growing even softer, and those sounds stay with you forever. Every night when I close my eyes, I can still hear them begging for mercy in languages I did not understand. The worst part is that I could not show them any mercy because innocent lives depended on me completing the mission. Several alien students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they began to understand that their comfortable academic distance from violence was an illusion. The historical battles they studied were not abstract tactical exercises, but real events that destroyed real lives and left permanent scars on the survivors. Commander Vextall realized that his classroom had transformed into something resembling a therapy session with 500 alien witnesses to a human psychological breakdown. The implications for interspecies relations could be catastrophic if this information spread beyond these walls. Yet he found himself genuinely concerned for Jiwon's welfare, recognizing signs of trauma that transcended species boundaries. The battle footage shows remarkable tactical brilliance, the commander said carefully, but it also shows something else. The flight patterns are not just strategic, they are emotional. There is anger driving those maneuvers and desperation and something that looks almost like... He paused, searching for the right word in galactic standard rage. Jiwon completed the sentence for him. Pure, focused rage at anything that threatened innocent lives. That is what humans become when everything we care about is in danger. We do not fight for glory or honor or tactical advantage, Commander. We fight because something inside us breaks when we see suffering that we have the power to prevent. The atmosphere in the massive auditorium continued to shift as the implications of Jiwon's revelation began to sink deeper into the minds of the alien students. What had started as a routine military history lesson had transformed into something far more unsettling, and dangerous. Commander Vextall found himself in completely uncharted territory, dealing with a situation that was not covered in any instructor's manual or training program. Relarian cadet named Zek raised one of his forearms, hesitantly, his multiple eyes blinking in confusion. "But humans are supposed to be peaceful," he said, his voice filled with genuine bewilderment. "Your species joined the Galactic Alliance as explorers and diplomats, not as warriors. Everyone knows that. Humans avoid violence whenever possible and prefer to solve conflicts through negotiation." Other alien students throughout the auditorium nodded vigorously in agreement, their understanding of human nature suddenly being called into serious question. For 50 years since first contact, humans had been the galaxy's poster children for peaceful coexistence and diplomatic conflict resolution. They ran humanitarian aid missions, served as neutral mediators in disputes between other species, and were widely known throughout the Alliance for their compassion and empathy. G1's expression grew noticeably darker as he looked around the room at the hundreds of confused alien faces staring down at him. "That is exactly what we wanted you to think," he said quietly, but his words carried clearly in the perfect acoustics of the Great Hall. Humans learned long ago that being underestimated is often the greatest tactical advantage you can possibly possess. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further as the meaning of his words began to register with the alien cadets. "While you have spent decades seeing us as weak and pacifistic creatures who somehow talked our way into Alliance membership, we have been quietly studying every military engagement, every species' combat capabilities, every possible weakness and tactical vulnerability." Yuna felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to her classmates speak in ways she had never heard before. This was not the G1 she thought she had known for 3 years. This person standing before them had a hardness in his dark eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond anything she could begin to imagine. Minho shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly aware that he might not understand his own species as well as he had always assumed. The peaceful diplomatic humans he had grown up learning about seemed to be just one face of a much more complex and potentially dangerous reality. Commander Vextall accessed even more classified files on his datapad, his scaled fingers moving with increasing urgency across the holographic interface. What he was discovering made his reptilian blood run cold. The human military records were far more extensive than had ever been. Publicly acknowledged battle after battle showed the same disturbing pattern, small groups of human fighters achieving impossible victories against overwhelming enemy odds. The Kepler station engagement was not an unusual event or some kind of lucky accident. G1 continued addressing the room with growing confidence and authority. It was standard operating procedure for human military forces. One human pilot properly motivated and equipped can eliminate threats that would normally require entire battle fleets from other species. A Thrakari cadet with multiple eyes blinked rapidly in visible distress as she tried to process this information. But the casualty reports from that battle showed massive enemy losses with virtually no damage. "To Alliance forces!" she said, her voice trembling. The tactical analysis suggested some kind of advanced artificial intelligence system or experimental weapon technology that we had never seen before. G1 shook his head slowly, his expression becoming even more serious. No advanced technology was required. He said simply, just a human pilot who understood that 17 minutes meant 17 minutes. Every second that those civilian evacuation ships remained in danger was another second that I had failed in my primary mission. He paused, letting his words sink into the minds of the alien students who were struggling to reconcile this revelation with their preconceptions. So I did what humans do when everything important is on the line and innocent lives hang in the balance. I became something that other species would call a monster. The auditorium fell into another heavy silence, but this time the quiet carried a completely different quality. It was not the shocked silence of surprise that had followed his initial revelation, but the deep, oppressive silence of genuine fear. These alien cadets were beginning to understand that their fundamental assumptions about humanity might be dangerously and catastrophically wrong. We do not fight the way that other species fight. Jiwan continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had seen combat from the inside. We do not follow honor codes or traditional tactical doctrines or established rules of engagement when human lives or innocent civilians are threatened. We fight to win using absolutely any means necessary. Several students from warrior species like the Kralians and Zentorians exchanged nervous glances. They had always prided themselves on their military traditions and combat prowess, but Jiwan's words suggested that humans approached warfare from a completely different psychological framework that might be far more effective than their own methods. A young Caraxian cadet with tentacle-like appendages raised one nervously. "But surely there must be limits," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even in war, there are accepted boundaries that civilized species do not cross. There are rules about protecting civilians and treating prisoners with basic dignity." Jiwan's laugh was cold and bitter, cutting through the air like a blade. "Of course there are rules," he said, "but rules only work when both sides agree to follow them. What happens when your enemy decides that civilians are acceptable targets? What do you do when following the rules means watching innocent people die?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the alien cadets to confront uncomfortable realities about the nature of warfare that their academic studies had carefully avoided. Most of their military education had focused on theoretical tactics and historical analysis rather than the brutal psychological realities that actual combat veterans had to live with. Commander Vextall realized that he was witnessing a fundamental shift in how these future Alliance officers would view both humanity and the nature of warfare itself. If word of this conversation spread throughout the Academy, it could alter the entire balance of power within the Galactic Alliance. The carefully maintained image of humans as peaceful diplomatic partners was cracking apart, revealing something much more complex and potentially threatening underneath. The classified files on his datapad painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Human military units had been involved in conflicts throughout Alliance space, always in small numbers and always achieving results that seemed mathematically impossible. The official reports consistently attributed these victories to superior technology or tactical innovation, but the truth was apparently much simpler and more frightening. Humans did not need advanced weapons or numerical superiority. They simply approached combat with a psychological framework that other species could not understand or replicate. When properly motivated, they became something that transcended normal military capabilities and entered the realm of legend days. Jiwan stood before the assembled alien cadets, his transformation from quiet student to revealed warrior was complete. The nervous young man who had sat in the back of classrooms for 3 years had been replaced by someone who radiated the quiet confidence of a person who had faced death and emerged victorious. But the victory had come at a terrible personal cost, and the psychological scars were clearly visible to anyone who looked closely enough. The Academy had been his attempt to find peace and normalcy, but that illusion was now shattered forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the massive galactic military academy as hundreds of cadets from dozens of different worlds hurried toward their classes. The academy was built like a small city with towering buildings made of gleaming metal and glass that reflected the light from 3 different suns. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as students rushed through the wide corridors carrying their datapads and talking in dozens of different languages. In the main auditorium, 500 cadets settled into their seats for what they thought would be another boring history lesson. The room was huge, with curved walls that seemed to stretch up forever, and a ceiling that showed a perfect view of the stars above. Commander Vextal's heavy footsteps echoed as he walked across the stage. His reptilian form was impressive even by alien standards. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with silver scales that caught the light and yellow eyes that missed nothing, he was the kind of instructor that made even the toughest cadets sit up straight. The students represented almost every species in the Galactic Alliance. There were the tall, graceful Valdorians with their crystal-like skin that changed colors with their emotions. The bulky Thrakari cadets took up extra space with their multiple arms and eyes that could see in different spectrums. At the back sat a group of Relarians, their 4 arms moving constantly as they took notes on multiple data pads. Once near the middle of the 3rd row sat 3 human cadets who looked tiny compared to most of their classmates. Jiwan kept his head down as usual, scribbling notes in his careful handwriting. His black hair fell across his face, hiding his dark eyes from view. Beside him sat Minho, a stocky young man who always seemed to be smiling and asking questions. Yuna sat on Jiwan's other side, her long hair pulled back in a neat ponytail as she organized her study materials with practiced efficiency. The 3 humans rarely spoke to each other during classes. They had been at the academy for 3 years now, but they kept to themselves most of the time. Other alien students often forgot they were even there. Humans were still new to the Galactic Alliance, having joined only 50 years ago. Most species saw them as soft creatures from a peaceful world who somehow talked their way into membership through clever diplomacy rather than military strength. Commander Vextal activated the massive holographic display that filled the front wall of the auditorium. The lights dimmed automatically and the room fell silent. The display showed a star map with dozens of red markers indicating battle sites from the recent Zephyrian War. Today we will examine one of the most studied battles in recent military history. The commander announced, his voice booming through the speakers without any need for amplification. His natural speaking voice was loud enough to fill the enormous room. The Battle of Kepler Station occurred during the height of the Zephyrian conflict, when unknown forces managed to destroy an entire enemy fleet in under 3 hours. The alien cadets leaned forward in their seats with interest. The Zephyrian War had ended before. Most of them were born, but it was still talked about in whispers. Military historians called it the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever seen, with casualty numbers that made even hardened veterans uncomfortable. What makes this battle unique, continued the commander, is that according to all official records, only 1 fighter craft engaged the enemy. Fleet intelligence reports from that time are still classified. But what we do know defies conventional military wisdom. A single pilot somehow managed to eliminate 43 enemy vessels, including heavy cruisers, and 2 massive dreadnoughts. Excited whispers spread through the crowd as the implications sank in. Different species began debating among themselves about which race could possibly achieve such an impossible victory. The Kralians were known for their berserker rage in battle. The Zentaurians had cybernetic enhancements that made them perfect soldiers. Some suggested it might have been an artificial intelligence system, or some kind of experimental weapon technology. The massive screen lit up with grainy combat footage that had been recovered from automated recording systems. The image quality was poor due to electromagnetic interference from the battle, but the basic details were clear enough. A single small fighter craft moved through space like a deadly dancer, weaving between massive enemy ships that fired everything they had at the tiny target. The unknown pilot seemed to predict every enemy movement. Before it happened, the fighter would roll away from incoming missiles just as they were fired, twist through gaps in defensive formations that seemed impossibly small, and return fire with surgical precision that took out critical systems on much larger vessels. Every shot seemed to count as weapons batteries exploded and engine cores overloaded in brilliant flashes of light. As the footage continued, the alien cadets watched in amazement. The small fighter moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost alive. The pilot flew like someone who understood not just the technical aspects of space combat, but the psychology of warfare. Each maneuver seemed designed not just to avoid damage, but to create maximum fear and confusion among the enemy forces. The camera angle shifted, showing the battle from different perspectives recovered from various sources. Some views came from the enemy ships themselves in their final moments before destruction. The footage showed massive warships that had been built to dominate entire star systems being systematically dismantled by something no bigger than a shuttlecraft. "Look at the movement patterns," Commander Vextal said as he highlighted certain sections of the footage. "Notice how the pilot never follows standard attack formations. This isn't textbook flying. This is someone who understands that rules are meant to be broken when lives are at stake. The enemy commanders probably spent years studying conventional tactics, but they were facing something completely different." The battle footage reached its most intense moment as the fighter craft found itself surrounded by 6 enemy cruisers in a coordinated trap. Any normal pilot would have tried to escape or called for backup, but instead of retreating, the unknown warrior dove directly into the center of the formation. The small craft spun like a top, while firing in all directions, creating a deadly sphere of energy that caught the enemy ships completely off guard. 3 of the cruisers exploded almost simultaneously as their main reactors were hit in rapid succession. The remaining vessels tried to adjust their positions, but the fighter was already moving again, sliding between their defensive grids like water through a net. More explosions lit up the darkness of space as critical systems failed under the relentless assault. The crowd of alien cadets sat in stunned silence as they watched the impossible become reality on the screen before them. This wasn't just superior technology or lucky shots. This was artistry combined with violence in a way that none of them had ever seen before. The pilot moved like someone who had been born for this moment, as if all of space combat was just an extension of their natural instincts, as the final enemy, Dreadnought, began to break apart under sustained fire. The footage started to fade. The recording systems had been damaged by electromagnetic pulses from the explosions, but the results were clear. An entire enemy fleet lay in ruins, while the single fighter craft remained intact. The room remained absolutely silent as the display went dark. Everyone was trying to process what they had just witnessed, the mathematical impossibility of one pilot defeating so many enemies, the tactical brilliance that allowed such precise strikes, the raw skill and determination that made victory possible against overwhelming odds. It was in this moment of stunned silence that Jiwan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hands gripped his data pad so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sweat began to form on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the auditorium. His breathing became shallow as memories he had tried so hard to bury began forcing their way back to the surface. The images on the screen matched perfectly with scenes that played in his nightmares every single night for the past 3 years. He remembered every moment of that battle, every enemy ship that exploded, every life that ended because of his actions. Every choice he made in those terrible 3 hours that saved thousands of innocent civilians but cost him his peace of mind. As the weight of recognition settled over him like a heavy blanket, Jiwan realized he could no longer remain silent. The truth was too big to contain any longer. His voice cut through the stunned silence of the auditorium like a knife through fabric. "That's me," he whispered. But in the perfect acoustics of the great hall, everyone heard those 2 simple words that would change everything. The sealed auditorium had transformed into something that resembled a military tribunal, or perhaps a confession booth with hundreds of unwilling alien witnesses to truths they were completely unprepared to handle. Commander Vextal found himself caught between his professional duty as an instructor and his growing understanding that this moment would fundamentally define how these future officers viewed both humanity and the true nature of warfare. Jiwan moved away from his seat in the EA Third row walking slowly toward the front of the massive room, where the frozen battle footage remained displayed on the enormous screen. His movements had changed completely, from the careful nervous steps of an anxious student to the fluid deadly grace of someone who had been trained extensively for combat. The hundreds of alien cadets tracked his progress with their various types of eyes, suddenly becoming aware that they were in the physical presence of a legendary figure they had only heard whispered about in conversations among senior military officers. The quiet human they had ignored for 3 years was apparently one of the most famous warriors in recent galactic history. You want to know the real secret about how humans prepare for war? Ji-won asked, turning to face the assembled crowd of confused and frightened alien faces. We do not train the way that other species train. We do not spend endless hours practicing standard formations or studying traditional tactical manuals or drilling repeatedly on advanced weapons systems. A puzzled murmur rippled through the diverse audience like waves spreading across a disturbed pond. The concept seemed completely absurd to species that had built their entire military. Doctrines on rigid training protocols, technological superiority, and centuries of established battlefield traditions. How could anything other than intensive preparation possibly make someone ready for the realities of combat? We tell stories, Ji-won, continued, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. Stories about what happens when everything goes completely wrong and there seems to be no possible way to succeed. Stories about ordinary people who somehow found extraordinary strength when their backs were pressed against the wall. The alien cadets exchanged bewildered glances as they tried to understand how storytelling could possibly prepare anyone for the brutal realities of space combat. Most of their species approached military training as a serious technical discipline requiring years of study and practice. Stories about individuals who absolutely refused to surrender or retreat, even when victory seemed mathematically impossible. Ji-won said, his eyes taking on a distant quality as if he was remembering specific tales from his childhood. Every human child grows up hearing these stories, and they become a fundamental part of our psychological makeup, Kira. The empathic Veldorian was becoming visibly distressed. As she continued to pick up on the complex emotional currents flowing through the auditorium, her crystalline features were reflecting the mixture of fear, admiration, and horror that Ji-won's revelations were generating among the alien students. Commander Vextel continued accessing increasingly classified files, his expression becoming more grave with each new document he reviewed. A disturbing pattern was emerging from the data that painted a deeply troubling picture of human military capabilities that had been deliberately concealed from other Alliance species for decades. The Kepler station engagement has been classified in all official records as a minor skirmish with minimal strategic importance. He announced, his voice carrying a note of genuine disbelief. But these restricted files show similar incidents across 17 different star systems over the past 30 years. The implications hit the alien cadets like physical blows as they began to understand what the commander was telling them. Small groups of human forces had been achieving victories throughout Alliance space that should have been completely impossible according to every known tactical doctrine and mathematical analysis. If humans had been systematically underreporting their true military capabilities for 5 decades, what else might they be deliberately hiding from their supposed allies? The carefully maintained public image of humanity as peaceful diplomatic explorers was rapidly crumbling, replaced by something far more complex and potentially threatening. Yuna finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that was haunting everyone in the sealed auditorium. Ji-won, how many others are there? How many humans currently serving in the Alliance have combat experience similar to yours? Her voice carried the weight of growing realization that she might not understand her own species nearly as well as she had always believed. Ji-won's smile was cold and completely humorless as he considered how to answer her question. "More than you think," he said finally. "But fewer than our enemies fear throughout the galaxy. But that is not really the important point here." He gestured toward the frozen battle scene still displayed on the massive screen. "The point is that every single human carries the potential for what you just witnessed in that combat footage. We simply choose not to access or use those capabilities unless the situation becomes absolutely desperate." The contrast between his words and his previous 3 years of quiet student behavior created a cognitive dissonance that left many alien cadets struggling to process the information. How could someone appear so normal and peaceful while carrying such capacity for violence that, "Pilot you have been watching and analyzing," Ji-won continued, pointing at the paused image. He was working as a civilian teacher before the war started, specialized in early childhood education, and genuinely loved working with younglings from dozens of different species across the Alliance. The stark contrast between the gentle profession of teaching children and the deadly efficiency displayed in the battle footage created a psychological shock that challenged everything the alien students thought they understood about the relationship between personality and combat capability. Several cadets from traditionally warrior species began whispering among themselves as they realized that their own military traditions might be fundamentally flawed. Human approaches to warfare seemed to operate on completely different principles that might be far more effective than anything they had been taught. Commander Vextall made a decision that would change the entire course of military education. Throughout the Galactic Alliance, he activated his secure communication system and began transmitting a priority message directly to Alliance Command headquarters. This revelation was far too significant to contain within a single classroom. Implications for interspecies relations and military planning needed to be addressed immediately at the highest levels of government. Before today, the Alliance leadership had operated under the assumption that they understood human capabilities and limitations. That assumption was now completely shattered. Within minutes of sending his message, the commander received a response marked with the highest possible security classifications. The speed of the reply indicated that his report had triggered emergency protocols at Alliance Command. The comfortable assumptions that had guided galactic politics for 50 years were about to be completely reevaluated as the alien cadets sat in stunned silence trying to process everything they had learned. Ji-won remained standing at the front of the auditorium, no longer the quiet student they thought they knew. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The galaxy was about to discover that they had been living alongside warriors who had been deliberately pretending to be something else entirely. The age of human innocence was ending, and what would replace it remained terrifyingly uncertain for every other species in the Alliance. The secure communication system activated with a series of urgent chimes that echoed through the sealed auditorium. Commander Vextall's personal datapad displayed an incoming priority message from Alliance Command headquarters marked with security. Classifications that most military officers would never see in their entire careers. The response had arrived in less than 10 minutes, which was faster than any non-emergency communication in the Academy's recorded history. The speed of the reply sent a clear signal that Ji-won's revelation had triggered the highest-level emergency protocols throughout the galactic government. Commander Vextall's expression grew increasingly serious as he read the encrypted message on his private display. The implications of this classroom conversation were apparently reverberating through every level of Alliance leadership, from military commanders to diplomatic corps to the highest civilian authorities. All cadets will remain in this auditorium until... Further notice, the commander announced, his voice now carrying the full weight of official military authority. What we have discussed here today is now classified at the maximum security level possible. You will not speak of this conversation to anyone outside this room without explicit written authorization from Alliance Command. The alien students exchanged worried glances as they suddenly understood that their casual mourning of military history had somehow transformed into a moment that could potentially reshape interspecies relations throughout the entire galaxy. Their comfortable academic world had been shattered and replaced by something far more complex and dangerous. Yiwan remained standing at the front of the massive room, but his posture had undergone another subtle change. The psychological weight he had been carrying alone for 3 years seemed noticeably lighter, now that his carefully guarded secret was finally out in the open. For the first time since his medical discharge and civilian reassignment, he did not have to pretend to be something he was not. The exhausting effort of maintaining a false identity as a peaceful student could finally end. "I know exactly what all of you are thinking right now," he said, addressing the crowd of nervous alien faces staring down at him. "You are wondering whether you can still trust humans, whether we have been deliberately lying to you for 50 years about who we really are and what we are truly capable of." His voice remained calm but carried an edge that reminded everyone present of the warrior they had seen in the historical battle footage. The quiet student mask had been completely discarded and would never be worn again. A Caraxian cadet with multiple tentacle-like appendages raised one nervously. If humans possess such extraordinary combat capabilities, why maintain the pretense of being peaceful? Why not claim your rightful place as a major military power within the alliance structure? The question struck at the very heart of human psychology and long-term strategic thinking in ways that most alien species could never fully comprehend. Jiwan took several moments to consider his response, carefully aware that his words would likely be analyzed by intelligence experts across dozens of worlds. Because being consistently underestimated is the greatest tactical weapon we could possibly possess. He finally answered, "Every species in the Alliance has spent decades studying our public military records and reaching the conclusion that humans are fundamentally weak. That means when a real threat eventually emerges, when something genuinely dangerous threatens the peace, we have all worked together to build our enemies will make exactly the same mistake that you have been making. They will assume we are not capable of effective resistance." Commander Vextall found himself nodding with reluctant admiration as he began to understand the true scope of humanity: long-term strategic planning. The peaceful diplomatic facade was not just political necessity or natural human temperament. It was a deliberately constructed tactical advantage that could prove absolutely decisive in future conflicts. The classified files on his data pad painted an increasingly clear picture of systematic deception that had been maintained at the highest levels of human government for 5 decades. While other species had been developing increasingly sophisticated weapons and military technologies, humans had been quietly perfecting something far more dangerous. They had been learning everything about every potential enemy while carefully concealing their own true capabilities. The psychological advantage this provided was almost impossible to calculate in traditional military terms. Yuna stood up slowly, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked the question that terrified her most deeply. "Jiwan, are you still that person from the battle footage? If something serious threatened the Academy, if we were all in mortal danger, would you become that warrior again?" The auditorium fell into complete silence as every alien cadet waited for his response. This was no longer an academic question about historical military engagements. It was about the fundamental nature of humanity itself and whether the violence they had witnessed was an aberration or a core characteristic. Jiwan looked around the massive room, slowly taking in the faces of alien classmates he had studied alongside. For 3 years, sharing meals and study sessions and casual conversations about their hopes for the future. These were not enemies or strangers, but friends and colleagues whose safety and well-being he had genuinely come to care about. His answer, when it finally came, was delivered with quiet certainty that sent chills through every person present. In a heartbeat, he said simply, "And I would not be alone." The implication hit the alien cadets like a physical blow as they realized that Ji-Wan was not unique among humans. Every member of his species apparently carried the same potential for transformation from peaceful civilian to deadly warrior when circumstances required it. The massive auditorium doors began to unseal as Alliance security. Officers entered in formation, their presence confirming that this conversation had already reached the very highest levels of galactic government. The comfortable assumptions that had guided interspecies relations for 50 years were being completely reevaluated. But the fundamental, Part 1, the Academy session. The morning sun cast long shadows across the massive galactic military academy as hundreds of cadets from dozens of different worlds hurried toward their classes. The academy was built like a small city with towering buildings made of gleaming metal and glass that reflected the light from 3 different suns. The air buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as students rushed through the wide corridors carrying their data, pads, and talking in dozens of different languages. In the main auditorium, 500 cadets settled into their seats for what they thought would be another boring history lesson. The room was huge, with curved walls that seemed to stretch up forever, and a ceiling that showed a perfect view of the stars above Commander Vextol's. Heavy footsteps echoed as he walked across the stage. His reptilian form was impressive even by alien standards, standing nearly 8 feet tall with silver scales that caught the light and yellow eyes that missed nothing. He was the kind of instructor that made even the toughest cadets sit up straight. The students represented almost every species in the Galactic Alliance. There were the tall, graceful Valdorians, with their crystal-like skin that changed colors with their emotions. The bulky Thrakari cadets took up extra space with their multiple arms and eyes that could see in different spectrums. At the back sat a group of Relarians, their 4 arms moving, constantly as they took notes on multiple data pads at once. Near the middle of the 3rd row sat 3 human cadets who looked tiny compared to most of their classmates. Ji-Wan kept his head down as usual, scribbling notes in his careful handwriting. His black hair fell across his face, hiding his dark eyes from view. Beside him sat Minho, a stocky young man who always seemed to be smiling and asking questions. Yuna sat on Ji-Wan's other side, her long hair pulled back in a neat ponytail as she organized her study materials with practiced efficiency. The 3 humans rarely spoke to each other during classes. They had been at the academy for 3 years now, but they kept to themselves most of the time. Other alien students often forgot. They were even there. Humans were still new to the Galactic Alliance, having joined only 50 years ago. Most species saw them as soft creatures from a peaceful world who somehow talked their way into membership through clever diplomacy, rather. Then military strength Commander Vextol activated the massive holographic display that filled the front wall of the auditorium. The lights dimmed automatically and the room fell silent. The display showed a star map with dozens of red markers indicating battle sites from the recent Zephyrian War. Today we will examine one of the most studied battles in recent military history. The commander announced, his voice booming through the speakers without any need for amplification. His natural speaking voice was loud enough to fill the enormous room. The Battle of Kepler Station occurred during the height of the Zephyrian conflict, when unknown forces managed to destroy an entire enemy fleet in under 3 hours. The alien cadets leaned forward, in their seats with interest. The Zephyrian War had ended before most of them were born, but it was still talked about in whispers. Military historians called it the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever seen, with casualty numbers that made even hardened veterans uncomfortable. What makes this battle unique continued. The commander is that according to all official records, only 1 fighter craft engaged the enemy fleet intelligence.